The question haunts every serious writer: what transforms mere verse into poetry that endures across centuries? Having spent decades wrestling with this mystery, I've discovered that lasting poetry emerges not from inspiration alone, but from a precise method, a way of seeing, feeling, and crafting that transforms fleeting experience into eternal art. The secret lies not in expressing personality, but in escaping it. True poetry becomes a vessel for universal experience, where individual consciousness dissolves into something larger than itself. This is the paradox every enduring poet must master. To write what lasts, you must write beyond yourself. Consider how fragments of Prufrock or The Waste Land continue resonating decades later. This isn't accident, it's the result of specific techniques that anchor poetry in both tradition and innovation, creating work that speaks to every generation while remaining rooted in timeless human experience. The method I'll share isn't formula but principle, not rules but understanding of how poetry transcends its historical moment to become what Keats called a thing of beauty that is indeed a joy forever. Chapter 1: The Foundation of Impersonality. The first principle of enduring poetry is the escape from personality into impersonality. Most beginning poets believe poetry means expressing themselves, their feelings, their thoughts, their unique perspective. This is precisely backward. Poetry that lasts expresses not the poet but the universal human condition through carefully chosen particulars. I learned this through painful experience. My early attempts at personal expression yielded nothing memorable. Only when I began seeking what I called the objective correlative, external facts that could embody internal states without naming them, did my poetry find its voice. The fog in Prufrock doesn't exist to describe a weather pattern but to embody a state of consciousness that every reader recognizes without explanation. This impersonality isn't coldness, it's precision. Rather than telling readers what to feel, you create conditions where feeling becomes inevitable. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes doesn't announce loneliness. It manifests loneliness so perfectly that readers experience it directly. The method requires constant vigilance against the confessional impulse. When emotion threatens to overwhelm technique, step back. Ask not, "How do I feel?" but "What external reality could make any reader feel this way?" The answer becomes your poem's concrete foundation. This principle explains why certain poets achieve immortality while others, perhaps more personally sincere, fade into obscurity. Shakespeare's sonnets endure not because they reveal Shakespeare's private life, but because they capture universal experiences of love, loss, and time through images so precise they feel both intimately personal and mysteriously larger than any individual personality. Practice this by examining your strongest emotions, then finding objective correlatives, external scenes, objects, or situations that embody these feelings without naming them. The fog, the patient etherized upon a table, the April rain, these images carry emotional weight because they exist independently of the poet's personal explanation. Chapter 2: Tradition as Creative Foundation. Lasting poetry never emerges from pure innovation but from what I've termed the creative relationship between tradition and individual talent. The poet who ignores tradition writes in a vacuum, the poet who merely imitates tradition writes in chains. Enduring poetry synthesizes inherited forms with contemporary consciousness. Understanding tradition doesn't mean memorizing literary history, it means developing what I call the historical sense, an awareness that all literature exists simultaneously, that Dante and contemporary poets inhabit the same artistic space. When you write, you join this conversation spanning centuries. Your contribution matters only if it adds something genuinely new while honoring what came before. This principle guided my composition of The Waste Land. The poem's power comes not from rejecting traditional forms but from fragmenting and recombining them to express 20th century consciousness. Shakespearean blank verse. medieval allegory, Sanskrit mantras, contemporary speech, all coexist because tradition provides the foundation that makes innovation meaningful. The method requires immersive reading in poetry that has endured. Read not for influence but for understanding. How did Donne achieve metaphysical wit? How does Milton sustain epic grandeur? How does Wordsworth transform simple language into profound insight? These techniques become available for contemporary use without slavish imitation. Begin by choosing one traditional form, sonnet, villanelle, blank verse, and mastering it completely. Understand its possibilities and limitations. Then push against those limitations while maintaining the form's essential structure. The tension between constraint and freedom generates the energy that makes poetry memorable. Remember that tradition includes not just English poetry but world literature. The Bhagavad Gita influenced my For Quartets as powerfully as any English predecessor. Drawing from multiple traditions enriches your work's resonance while avoiding narrow nationalism. The goal isn't to write like earlier poets but to write with their depth and permanence. Tradition provides not models to copy but standards to meet. When you understand how Homer achieved timelessness, you can pursue similar permanence through contemporary means. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Time. Poetry that endures transcends its historical moment by mastering what I call the architecture of time, the ability to make past, present, and future inhabit the same poetic space. This isn't mere technique but a fundamental understanding of how consciousness actually works, how memory, perception, and anticipation interweave in human experience. Most poetry remains trapped in single temporal dimensions. Occasional verse celebrates present moments, nostalgic poetry mourns the past, visionary poetry projects ideal futures. But lasting poetry achieves what I discovered in For Quartets, the intersection of temporal and eternal, where specific moments become windows into timeless patterns. The method begins with recognizing that every present moment contains traces of the past and seeds of the future. When I write, time present and time past / are both perhaps present in time future, I'm describing not metaphysical speculation but observable psychological reality. Your consciousness right now contains childhood memories, immediate sensations, and anticipated futures, all simultaneously present. Practical application requires what I call layered composition. Begin with a specific present moment, standing in a garden, walking through a city, observing a face. But don't stop with surface description. Let that moment evoke related moments from different times. The garden today recalls the garden of childhood, anticipates the garden after death. These temporal layers create the depth that makes poetry rereadable across decades. Consider how Burnt Norton transforms a simple garden visit into meditation on time itself. The technique involves patient observation of how memory and perception actually function, then crafting language that reproduces this layered experience for readers. The garden becomes both particular place and universal symbol because it carries multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. This temporal architecture explains why certain lines echo across generations. April is the cruelest month, endures because it captures not just one spring's arrival but the eternal human ambivalence toward renewal, hope mixed with fear, beauty shadowed by awareness of impermanence. The line exists outside historical time while remaining grounded in specific seasonal observation. Practice by choosing moments of personal significance, then exploring their temporal depths. How does this moment connect to similar moments across your lifetime? What patterns emerge? What universal experiences does your particular memory illuminate? The answers provide poetry's raw material, which technique transforms into lasting art. Chapter 4: Language as Living Music. Enduring poetry achieves what prose cannot. It makes language itself musical, creating rhythms that outlast their original cultural context. This isn't merely pleasant sound but essential meaning. In poetry that lasts, Music and sense become inseparable, each reinforcing the other until the poem achieves inevitability. The method requires training your ear to hear language's natural music. English possesses inherent rhythms based on stress patterns, vowel relationships, and consonant combinations. Great poetry doesn't impose artificial music on language but discovers and intensifies the music already present. This is why Shakespeare's iambic pentameter feels natural rather than forced. It follows English speech's underlying pulse. Begin by reading poetry aloud obsessively. Not silently, which engages only intellectual understanding, but vocally, which activates the bodily knowledge that creates lasting rhythms. Listen for how stress patterns create expectation and fulfillment, how vowel sequences generate emotional coloring, how consonant clusters provide textural variety. My own practice involved endless revision focused solely on sound. Prufrock achieved its hypnotic quality through careful attention to rhythm, assonance, and alliteration working together. The famous lines, "I have measured out my life with coffee spoons," succeed not just conceptually but musically. The measured rhythm embodies the meaning while the long vowels create appropriate melancholy. The goal isn't decorative prettiness but functional beauty. Every sound choice should serve the poem's larger purpose. Hard consonants for emphasis, liquid consonants for flow, short vowels for urgency, long vowels for contemplation. These aren't rules but resources, available for poets who develop sufficient sensitivity to language's musical possibilities. Free verse doesn't escape this principle but makes it more challenging. Without traditional meter's framework, you must create unique rhythmic structures for each poem. This requires even more sensitive ears, not less. The music must emerge from the poem's particular content while achieving the memorability that traditional forms provide automatically. Practice by taking successful passages from great poets and analyzing their sound patterns minutely. What creates their effectiveness? How do rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, and assonance work together? Then attempt similar effects with your own content, understanding that technical mastery provides the foundation for eventual innovation. Remember that poetry's music should enhance rather than overwhelm meaning. The two elements must achieve perfect marriage, where neither dominates but both contribute to unified effect that transcends what either could accomplish alone. Chapter 5: The Precision of Images. Images provide poetry's foundation, not decoration but structure. Enduring poetry achieves what I call precision of images, where carefully chosen details carry more weight than abstract statements ever could. The method involves selecting concrete particulars that embody universal experiences without requiring explanation. Most failed poetry suffers from imprecise imagery, details chosen for superficial prettiness rather than essential rightness. But images that last possess what I term inevitability. They feel not just appropriate but necessary, as if no other details could convey the same meaning as effectively. Consider my image of the patient etherized upon a table. This wasn't arbitrary comparison but precise correlation between external image and internal state. The evening's paralysis, uncertainty, and vulnerability become immediately accessible through this medical metaphor. Readers understand the feeling without needing the poet's personal explanation. The method requires patient observation of how consciousness actually works. We don't experience abstract concepts directly but through sensory perceptions, memories, and associations. Poetry that endures translates abstract experiences back into the concrete images through which we originally apprehended them. Practical application begins with image collection. Observe constantly, recording not just what you see but how specific details affect your emotional and intellectual responses. Why does afternoon light through windows create melancholy? What makes certain urban sounds suggest loneliness? How do seasonal changes embody human temporality? The goal isn't photographic accuracy but emotional precision. Images succeed when they trigger in readers the same responses they generate in observant poets. This requires understanding how sensory details connect to psychological states, not through arbitrary association but through observable patterns of human response. Avoid images that merely illustrate predetermined meanings. Instead, let images discover their own meanings through careful selection and arrangement. The fog in Prufrock wasn't chosen to symbolize confusion, it was chosen because fog's actual behavior perfectly embodies a particular state of consciousness that readers recognize immediately. Practice involves constant refinement. Begin with general images, then specify relentlessly. Not bird, but blackbird. Not blackbird singing, but blackbird whistling. Not whistling, but whistling / among the olive trees. Each specification increases precision while eliminating alternative interpretations that might dilute impact. Remember that powerful images often combine familiar elements in unexpected ways. The patient etherized upon a table joins medical procedure with natural phenomenon, creating cognitive tension that forces deeper attention. This tension generates the energy that makes images memorable long after first reading. Chapter 6: Form as Meaning. In poetry that endures, form isn't container for meaning but meaning itself. The way a poem moves through space and time on the page, how it arranges stanzas, deploys line breaks, and organizes rhyme schemes, these elements communicate as powerfully as explicit content. Mastering this principle separates competent poets from those whose work achieves permanence. Traditional forms possess accumulated meaning from centuries of use. The sonnet carries associations with love, philosophy, and formal argument that become available to contemporary practitioners. But merely adopting traditional forms isn't sufficient. You must understand why specific formal elements create specific effects. Then use this knowledge purposefully. Consider how The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock uses irregular rhyme and varied line lengths to embody its protagonist's psychological fragmentation. The form doesn't describe uncertainty, it enacts uncertainty through its structure. Readers experience Prufrock's mental state directly through the poem's formal properties. The method requires treating every formal decision as meaningful. Where do you break lines? Why? How does enjambment affect reading pace and emphasis? How do stanza breaks create pauses that allow meaning to accumulate? These aren't arbitrary choices but opportunities to reinforce content through structure. Free verse demands even more attention to form because traditional patterns aren't available as automatic guidance. Every line break becomes crucial decision. Every stanza division significant choice. Without inherited formal logic, you must create unique organizational principles for each poem while maintaining coherence and progression. My approach to The Wasteland demonstrated how fragmented form could embody cultural fragmentation while achieving overall unity through recurring motifs and careful arrangement. The poem's difficulty mirrors modern consciousness's complexity, but its structure provides sufficient guidance for careful readers to discover meaning through patient attention. Practice by studying how great poets use form purposefully. How does Shakespeare's sonnet structure support argumentative development? How do Yeats's complex stanza patterns reinforce thematic content? How does Williams's triadic line arrangement affect reading rhythm and visual impression? Experiment with constraining yourself through arbitrary formal rules, then discovering how these constraints generate unexpected creative possibilities. Limitation often produces innovation because it forces solutions that wouldn't emerge from unlimited choice. The tension between formal restriction and expressive freedom creates energy that readers experience as excitement. Remember that form should feel inevitable rather than imposed. The best formal choices seem to emerge naturally from content while simultaneously shaping that content in ways that increase precision and impact. This reciprocal relationship between form and meaning distinguishes poetry from prose while creating the aesthetic satisfaction that makes certain poems permanently rewarding. Chapter 7. The Alchemy of Revision. The final principle of enduring poetry involves what I call the alchemy of revision, the patient process through which ordinary language transforms into something extraordinary. No poem achieves permanence in its first draft. Lasting poetry emerges through sustained refinement that continues until every word, rhythm, and image achieves maximum effectiveness. Most poets revise too little or revise wrong directions. They adjust surface elements while leaving fundamental problems unaddressed, or they revise toward personal satisfaction rather than objective excellence. The method requires ruthless honesty about what actually works versus what you wish worked. My practice involved multiple revision stages, each focusing on different elements. First draft captures initial inspiration and establishes basic structure. Second draft clarifies meaning and improves logical progression. Third draft refines sound patterns and rhythmic effects. Fourth draft achieves maximum precision in word choice and image selection. Final drafts eliminate everything unnecessary while ensuring every remaining element serves the poem's central purpose. The key insight is that revision isn't correction but discovery. Through patient reworking, you uncover the poem's essential identity, what it really wants to be rather than what you initially imagined. This requires abandoning attachment to favorite passages that don't serve the whole, accepting that beautiful lines must sometimes disappear for poems to achieve their full potential. The Waste Land exemplifies this principle. The original manuscript was nearly twice as long as the published version. Ezra Pound's editorial suggestions helped me recognize which passages were truly essential versus which were merely competent. The final poem's power comes partly from what was removed, everything that diluted rather than concentrated effect. Develop objective criteria for revision decisions. Does this image increase or decrease precision? Does this rhythm support or work against the poem's emotional movement? Does this stanza break create meaningful pause or arbitrary interruption? These questions provide guidance when personal preference becomes unreliable. Read your drafts aloud repeatedly, listening for awkwardness, monotony, or unclear progression. The ear often detects problems that eyes miss, particularly rhythm problems and sound conflicts. If you stumble reading your own poem aloud, readers will certainly stumble reading it silently. Time provides essential perspective for effective revision. Put completed drafts aside for weeks or months, then return with fresher judgment. What seemed brilliant immediately after composition often reveals flaws when approached with temporal distance. Conversely, passages that initially seemed weak sometimes prove more effective than originally appreciated. The revision process never truly ends. Even published poems can be improved through continued attention. But practical completion occurs when further changes would alter the poem's essential character rather than enhance its effectiveness. This requires developing sensitivity to when enough revision is enough, avoiding the perfectionism that prevents poems from reaching readers. Remember that revision aims not for perfection but for inevitability, the sense that every element belongs exactly where it appears, that no other arrangement could achieve similar effect. This inevitability creates the impression of effortlessness that characterizes poetry capable of enduring across centuries. Conclusion. The method I've shared emerges from decades of wrestling with poetry's fundamental challenges. These aren't rules but principles, guides for discovering your own authentic voice while joining the conversation that spans centuries of human expression. Remember that lasting poetry serves something larger than personal expression. It becomes a lens through which readers discover aspects of their own experience they couldn't articulate alone. This service requires the humility to escape personality while paradoxically achieving the most enduring form of immortality available to human consciousness. The path demands patience, technical mastery, and willingness to revise relentlessly toward objectives that transcend immediate satisfaction. But the reward, creating art that continues speaking to readers you'll never meet, in circumstances you can't imagine, justifies every difficulty. Begin where you are, with whatever understanding you currently possess. Read deeply, write constantly, revise ruthlessly. Let tradition guide without constraining. Seek not to express yourself but to express through yourself something universal and eternal. The fragments you assemble through careful attention to these principles may indeed soar against the ruins of time, becoming part of the ongoing human conversation about what matters most in our brief journey between darkness and darkness.